Welcome to the Crimson and Motive podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra. Join me as we explore the dark, twisted stories of murder, serial killers, and the demented. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Crimson and Motive. I want to start by thanking all of my listeners in joining me on my journey of starting a true crime podcast, especially one in particular. I received this review from Kate. Alexandra is a young and new podcaster, but she is doing a great job at guiding us through the mechanics of heinous true crime cases with a sweet little voice. She has thoroughly researched each case, and I especially enjoyed hearing her personal thoughts at the conclusion. Stick with it, Alex. Don't let anyone stand in your sunshine, and no matter what, don't give up, girl. Thank you so much, Kate. I can't even begin to describe how happy I was when I read this. For anyone out there that has thought about doing podcasts, my advice is just this. Just do it. If you are passionate about something, it will reflect in your work. I've debated for 2 years on doing this, and I was very worried and always stalled. But honestly, I finally just decided one day to drive to Best Buy to grab a mic, download editing software, create my logo, and away I went, and I haven't looked back. And to hear all of the positive feedback makes me feel like my hard work is finally paying off. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you so much for staying with me. If you want to leave a review or send me an email, please reach me at crimsonandmotive, that's AND@gmail.com, or on my Facebook page at Crimson and Motive to possibly be mentioned on the next show. Now, let's begin with this week's episode. I wanted to really get into a family unit for this week, and what better way to do it than to explore America's first serial killing family, the Bloody Benders. So let's go back to 1870 to southeast Kansas and explore the heinous acts of the Bender family. In 1870, the United States was drastically changing. In Lebec County, which is translated to the Beast, had two possible origins for its name. The first was that a group of French trappers encountered a skunk by Lebec Creek. The other story was that it was named after Pierre Bette, who was a French-Canadian trapper who married into the Osage tribe and lived along the Neosho River between the 1830s and the 1840s. By the 1870s, the land was drastically changing. The population went from 9,973 at the start of 1870 to 22,735 by 1880. Why do you ask? Manifest destiny. Depending who you are, the manifest destiny can be interpreted two ways. The first was that hopeful settlers would make the push west to own land and be prosperous. The second was the indigenous population were forced from their homes in order to make way for European settlers. In Kansas, railroads were scarce and relatively new, so most hopeful settlers would travel along the Osage Trail to get their destination by way of a team of horses and wagon. Now picture it. You've been traveling for days, maybe weeks along the trail. You haven't had a decent meal or a place to comfortably rest for a while. But then along the trail, you see a crudely lettered sign that says groceries. That was the situation for Mr. Jones, a hopeful traveler. He came across this 2-room cabin along the Osage Trail and entered into the Bender Inn. At first glance, he can see past the cabin a thatched roof barn with a garden and orchard that contained roughly 50 fruit trees. The men would toil away outside working hard on the garden, but yet neighbors reported that nothing would prosper from it. When Mr. Jones first walked in, he is approached by a German-American family consisting of 2 men and 2 women. The men first arrived in Kansas as one of the first of 5 European families in the region in October of 1870. The women shortly followed in 1871. Mr. Jones walks into the front room, which consisted of a kitchen, a small store with tobacco and provisions, and a small area to lay his head. He looks over and sees John Bender Sr., or Pa, a 60-year-old man that could barely speak English. Next to him would be his wife Elvira, or Ma, who was 55 years old. She has a mean scowl on her face and clearly unapproachable. Locals would dub her a she-devil. Then he hears a laugh in the corner. It came from 25-year-old John Bender Sr. He spoke perfect English with a slight German accent. He was always laughing, which some believed him to be a half-wit, but nonetheless very charming and good-looking. Mr. Jones sits down and is offered a seat at the head of the table, along a curtain that separates the inn from the Benders' living quarters. He smells the food cooking across the kitchen by the beautiful Kate. She was a gorgeous 23-year-old with auburn hair. She spoke English fluently and considered herself a self-proclaimed healer and psychic. People would come to the house and partake in supernatural activities with Kate at the helm. They began asking Mr. Jones strange questions like, "How much money do you have? Where are you traveling from? What are your plans?" He gladly answers their curious questions. They're peculiar indeed. Nonetheless, Mr. Jones assumes that they are attempting to be friendly with the very little English vocabulary they know, but he notices one of the men getting closer with his feet tucked under the curtain. But it doesn't matter. He hasn't had a good meal in... Then it's black. Mr. Jones is never seen again until his body was discovered in May 1871 along Drum Creek with a crushed skull and a slit throat. In February 1872, 2 more unidentified men would meet the same fate. Both would be found with their skulls crushed and their throats slit. By the fall, many people disappeared along the Osage Trail, which would have weary travelers stay clear of the trail. Many people would set up vigilante groups to catch these invisible monsters, but every person caught would eventually be released. But then something terrible happened. George Newton Longcore, a widow from Independent, Kansas, was traveling with his 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann, to start a new life for themselves. They bought a team of horses and a wagon from his neighbor, Dr. William York. But when word came back to York that there has been no sign of Longcore or his infant daughter, and only the team of horses he sold them were found abandoned near Fort Scott, he decided to go and find them. He went around asking questions to anyone who might have seen Longcore, but he too became tired and stopped along the Osage Trail to the Bender Inn. He would never be heard from again. What the Benders didn't know, though, was who Dr. York actually was. He was the brother of Civil War veteran, lawyer, and politician Colonel Alexander M. York. Like his brother, he went on his own investigation with his team consisting of 50 others, including his younger brother, and what they uncovered was stomach-turning. Colonel York was considered a dangerous adversary. He started his investigation with his friends and local law enforcement officers in Independent and Cherryvale. He would eventually realize the demise of not only his brother, but to many others that had disappeared around the vicinity of the Bender family farm. He pieced together testimony from survivors who claimed they were assaulted and threatened. The family would ask them intensely curious questions, including how much money they had and where they were going, and people would claim that they would hear weird sounds coming from the home. It freaked out the locals, so much so that no one would travel past the house at night due to the gloom in the air. Colonel York collected his posse of 50 strong and headed to the Bender Inn. Upon confrontation, the Bender family spoke a nervous admission that York's brother did indeed show up to the residence, had eaten, watered his horse, purchased a few things, and then rode off. But one of the posse members recognized Kate, the psychic healer, and relayed this information to Colonel York and suggested that she perform a seance to help find York's missing brother. She quickly came up with an excuse and claimed that the conditions were unfavorable, and this was due to having too many men at the residence. She told Colonel York to come back the next day alone and said, "I'll find your brother for you, even if he is in hell." He agreed to come back alone. A few days later, people noticed cattle were running loose, animals were starving, and a deserted wagon and team were located 12 miles north of the Bender farm near the town of Thayer. The local newspaper, Thayer Highlight, got wind of this and reported this as a local mystery on April 9, 1873. On May 4th, neighbors went to the farm as they worried that the Bender family had received the same fate as the other disappearances. But due to the gloomy atmosphere of the home, no one dared enter the residence. Some locals inspected the abandoned wagon and found a sign saying groceries with crude lettering. The sign was similar to the sign that was missing from the family farm. A 2-man committee was sent to investigate the disappearance. They determined the wagon did indeed belong to the Bender family. The committee interviewed the Santa Fe ticket agent who confirmed they sold a ticket to a German family of 4 3 weeks earlier. With this news, the committee went back to the family farm to proclaim that the Bender family were not victims, but complicit in the disappearances of other people. The community finally conjured up the courage, along with Colonel York's brother, to enter the home. They discovered the Bender family left in a hurry. They found clothing and utensils scattered across the home and furniture overturned and broken. But the most shocking part of their discovery was found in the kitchen. In the front room, they found a cleverly concealed trapdoor that led to a damp cellar. Upon opening the door, the group was hit with the foul-smelling odor of old blood and death. The stench was so bad that the group had to wait until the house was removed on wheels before they could examine the cellar. After they moved the house, a few volunteers entered and found human blood and a narrow passage that led to the garden and orchard. When they inspected the grounds, the depressions of the ground looked calculated, too calculated, especially for a family that was terrible at horticulture. The length was approximately the size of an average man on each depression. Curious, the York brother grabbed a wagon rod and drove it into the earth, and he felt something under the ground. They quickly dug it up, and suddenly York was staring at his dead brother, Dr. William York. Colonel York rushed to the property the next day to assist in unearthing the other bodies. All of them had the same cause of death. Their skulls were crushed by a blunt object and their throats slit, all except for one. The one body was determined to be buried alive. Unlike the others, this body was a young female that had beautiful golden hair. It would be the body of 18-month-old Mary Ann Longcore. The remaining bodies would be later identified as Ben Brown from Howard County, and he was missing $2,600, which today would be $56,167. W.F. McCrotty, who was missing $38, which today would be $821. Henry Mackenzie, missing $36, which today would be $778. Johnny Boyle, missing $10, which today would be $216. He was also missing a pacing mirror, saddle that was worth $850, which today would be $18,362. He was found in the Bender's well. Marianne's father, George Newton Longcore, was also found, and he was missing $1,900, which today would be $41,045. John Greery, Red Smith, Abigail Roberts. Various body parts were also found, which were never identified. And also during the search, the bodies of 4 unidentified males were found in Drum Creek and surrounding areas. The discovery of the bodies would have more people come forward that would help the investigation establish an MO. The guests would be seated at the head of the table in front of a curtain. The Benders were usually unable to carry out a conversation, so they asked direct questions to determine if these guests would be their next victims. But in most cases, this line of inquiry would scare off the guests. A signal from Kate, who was usually cooking meals in the kitchen, would have one of the men place a foot by the guest to outline the body and to signal the other man standing behind the curtain. The man would then club the guest with a heavy sledgehammer, and then the family would push them down the trap door to the cellar to be finished off at a later date. One traveler, William Pickering, said that when he had refused to sit near the wagon cloth because there were stains on it, he was met with a knife held by Kate, so he fled. A Catholic priest fled immediately after seeing one of the men hiding a sledgehammer. A Catholic priest fled immediately after seeing one of the men hiding a sledgehammer. Then there were 2 men who wanted to see the psychic ability of Kate, but when they refused to eat at the table and instead on a counter, Kate became very hostile, which then alerted the 2 men from behind the curtain. They immediately fled. Also during the investigation, bullet holes were found within the house, within the walls, and on the property. This had investigators believe that after people were hit with sledgehammers, they would try to fight back, and a fight would ensue. Most of the victims were looking for farms around the area and held large sums of money, as you can tell with the amount of money that was missing from the bodies. The Benders were careful at targeting strangers so that they would be untraceable, which is true for many of the bodies that were found. After the MO was established, the Benders were wanted for murder, and the local authorities offered large sums of money, but only bits of information was given to the local sheriff, G.W. Franklin. So, where did they go? Well, no one knows, and possibly no one will ever know. But there are many interesting theories. First, as I stated earlier, the Benders were reported to have purchased tickets in Thayer, Kansas, on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway to Humboldt. It was rumored that they had doubled back to take the MK&T train south through the indigenous territory to Denison, Texas. Another rumor was that an 8-member posse returned from this territory and claimed to have ultimately given up on the hunt. But then, 3 years later, a man said on his deathbed that he was a part of the posse and that they executed the Benders. They then divided up $7,000 in cash found on the Benders and swore a solemn oath that they would never speak of this again. I mean, it's plausible, but I highly doubt it. There was a steep reward for presenting the Benders to the local sheriff, either dead or alive. So I highly doubt they would keep this a secret, as they would be considered heroes. Another theory is that Colonel York fulfilled his promise to come back the next day, killed them all, and then buried them in unmarked graves. He then hired actors to portray the family at the train station to make it appear as though they fled. However, he stated the following in his later years: "This is not true. Had I taken part in the killing of the Benders, I would have been glad to have added this act to another one of the good deeds in my life." The mystery surrounding the Benders' disappearance was so popular that any two women traveling together would immediately be accused of being the Bender women. In fact, two particular women were accused of being Elvira and Kate. This caused a frenzy between two groups, one who believed it to be the Bender women and ones who didn't. There was one problem. They both spoke perfect English. Before they had their day in court, the charges would be dropped. A detective claimed that he had traced Kate and John Jr. to the border, where he had found that John Jr. had died of apoplexy. He also claimed that Ma and Pa Bender did not leave the train station at Humboldt, but instead continued north to Kansas City, where it is believed that they purchased tickets for St. Louis, Missouri. Another story is that a vigilante group found the family and shot everyone but Kate. They then burned her alive. On the other hand, another vigilante group claimed that they had lynched the family and dumped them in the Verdigris River. Lastly, another group claimed that they won a shootout with the family. It is unknown if any of these stories are the truth, and in fact, the reward money has never been claimed. In 1884, a man matching John Sr.'s description was held in Montana for murder. The same MO was used on the victim, which was blunt force trauma to the head in Salmon, Idaho. A request was submitted for a positive identification, but the man severed his foot in order to escape, but bled to death. The body was so badly decomposed before the Cherryvale police were able to arrive, so any hope of identification was permanently gone. Nonetheless, the skull of this man was put on display in a Salmon saloon up until the Prohibition, and it was labeled Pa Bender. So, here is my strange discovery. For those of you that don't know, I am currently completing my Bachelor of Arts in History at the current moment, so I do a lot of research in archives and primary source documents, and I found two strange pieces of information. The first is that I tried to research the immigrant archives of German settlers entering the United States by cross-checking immigration applications and ship itineraries. Out of the thousands of Benders that immigrated from Germany in the 19th century, I could never find anyone associated with both Johns, Elvira, Kate, or even John Sr.'s other name, William, in the database that matched those dates. The second is that they designed the kill house months prior to the women moving in, so clearly it was their motive the whole time to start killing relatively quickly. So, in my mind, and bear with me, that leaves two possible scenarios. The first is that they were in fact German, but they fled persecution under aliases. So, I attempted to research some data on unsolved cases in Germany, but unfortunately, the only thing I found was that crime trends were only reported in a national database beginning in 1882. But it did show an influx in crime between 1880 and 1890 due to the Industrial Revolution and urbanization in Germany. The second possible scenario was that they were not German at all, and this was all a ruse. They have been suspected of being another killer family called the Kelly family, which if you want me to profile them, please let me know. If this is indeed true, I mean, what's to say that this isn't anything new for them? What do you think of these theories? Do you have any of your own? I would love to know what you think, so please reach me at crimsonandmotive, that's AND, @gmail.com, or on Facebook at Crimson and Motive. Thank you again for joining me for this week's episode of Crimson and Motive. See you next week.